It's really lovely to be here, and I would like to thank LCA for the invite, the organization itself, and I'd like to thank Dave Pepler for roping me into doing this talk this evening. And Chris, thank you so much for inviting me. It's really lovely to be here, and I hope that I will be sharing some information that will be of interest whilst we delve into unlocking nature, and in particular, trying to understand how nature is a pharmacy. So I am at Stellenbosch University, and I lead the medicinal plant group in the Department of Botany and Zoology. And please feel free to tweet. I'm at Nox the Lion. And if you are on Instagram and you want to share something there, also feel free. If you want to tag me, I am at Nox_Makunga. And on Facebook, it's just Nox Makunga. So please do interact with the different social media platforms that you may have. And if there's something that's exciting and interesting for you, please don't feel nervous to live tweet. So I'm going to get going with this, and I will take us through some work that I have been doing in my laboratory and ultimately round it off. But I want to start by pointing us to these mega biodiverse centers of the world. And South Africa happens to be a mega biodiverse center. And this is because it is home to an incredible floral diversity, and it is amongst the richest countries in the world. And here in South Africa, we have 3 biodiversity hotspots, but it sounds like there might be a 4th one on the way. So the biodiversity hotspots that are important here happen to be the Cape Floristic region, which is about 9,000 species in a very small area, and the iconic Protea cineroides, the king protea, which is South Africa's national flower, happens to be part of the plants of this region. And then we have the succulent karoo, which has the world's largest amount of succulent species, 10,000 succulent species, 630 geophytes, and these often pop up in the middle of winter, and people go and chase them because it's quite a spectacular show. And last but not least, I want to bring up Maputoland, Pondoland, Albany corridor, and hopefully I'm not going to say that too many times tonight because that's a little bit of a tongue twister. So I might just call it MPA, with 1,900 plant endemics, plants that are only found in that particular area. So where are these places that I've been talking about in South Africa? So that is in green here. We have this Cape Floristic region, or the CFR. And in that pale yellow, we've got the succulent karoo, which is stretching from the Klein Karoo, small, large Karoo, and then all the way up into Namakwaland. And iconic species like this quiver tree, for example, are found punctuating the landscape of these areas. And some of these plants are facing a threat. And in this particular case, with the quiver tree, it's facing a potential climate-related threat. And plants like the Vulture mirabilis are quite fascinating because they take long time to grow, and many interesting species that are actually found in this greater Cape Floristic region, if I can call it that. On the eastern seaboard of South Africa, on the other hand, you've got a whole range of different biomes This is mainly where the forests are found. That's where the MPA is. And some plants, such as this wild ginger, is actually extinct in certain places in the wild. So these are aspects that we should be thinking about in terms of, thinking about conserving this biodiversity whilst appreciating it, because in many of these regions, these plants are really important to people. Now let's get back into this diversification of plants in the Cape area. How did this come about? This has fascinated natural historians for a really, really long time. And there have been several different proposals from natural scientists with regards to this kind of plant biodiversity. Some have said that it's the landscape and ecological environments that are so unique that have led to this type of biodiversification. For example, there are more plants that are indigenous to Table Mountain than there are in the whole entire United Kingdom. Some people have said that the radiation of species is actually not necessarily as a singular event, but through a mixture of old and new radiations. And that has established the level of species richness within this part of the world. Some have also alluded to the pollination syndromes that are very unique, these plant-animal interactions that are uniquely adapted for this particular environment. And so these environments are quite unique, and the plants that are in these areas are very well adapted to these environments. In places like the Tankwa Karoo, there are many times when there is virtually very little going on there in terms of plant life during the dry seasons. But when the rains come, then some of the plants that are local to that area explode into flower. So the plants themselves have become uniquely adapted to the environments themselves. And this part of the world is also known as having a fire-prone environment, and this is critical as part of the life strategy of the fynbos. So all of this has really generated a large plant biodiversity, and the geoclimatic conditions have led to beautiful species that happen to be moreas, streptocarpus, that might even be found in places like the Eastern Cape. And also, nutrient acquisition strategies have been very specialized, especially for the fynbos, because proteas, for example, generate a set of cluster roots, and these cluster roots assist with acquiring mineral nutrition from soils that are extremely poor. And all of these aspects, the geoclimatic conditions, nutrient acquisition strategies that are well adapted to the environment, the phenology of these plants, the plant-animal interactions are thought to have led really to an explosion of biodiversity here in the Cape. And some species, for example, drosseras, you have unique drosseras that are actually found in this area that are carnivorous. And you have plants such as Dioscorea, for example, that is found in the area, and that's extremely important to people. And then beautiful succulents that are really unique, that have really caused a craze in other parts of South Africa as horticultural species because of their curiosity. And this in itself is actually driving a potential threat of extinction, particularly for species such as conophytums. So you've met some plants, you understand a little bit about the biodiversity of South Africa. So now, what about its people? The people of South Africa are also socially and culturally diverse. And the way in which they utilize these plants has really generated a different set of indigenous knowledge systems. And these indigenous knowledge systems are quite unique and diverse, and somehow they reflect the different people that are actually found here in Southern Africa. And that is exciting because any place that has a large plant biodiversity and has a large sociocultural diversity is a place where you have unique ethnopharmacopoeia that are important to different communities. And that serves as an inspiration for somebody like me, who happens to be a medicinal plant scientist. So how did this sociocultural diversity come about, and how did these indigenous knowledge systems really get generated? Well, we're taking a walk through time, and we're going back into time and looking into the past, where the Kwekwe and the San people, the Aboriginal people of Southern Africa, were the ones that knew much about the plants that actually lived here. And then if we shifted along into the Bantu migration times, where the Bantu people transversed from Central Africa along the eastern part of Africa and ultimately met up with the Kwekwe and the San. And that resulted in a lot of knowledge sharing and again, creating unique opportunities and information with regards to different plants that are used by people. And at the time of the European colonists who brought along people from Asia, this again created a new cultural dimension into these different knowledge systems that are found in South Africa. And there are even influences of Ayurvedic medicine within the different indigenous knowledge systems of Southern Africa. So this has really created an incredible tapestry that is an exciting place to be and to work, where plants are actually used by people and are used in very many different ways by the cultures of South Africa. So if you're sitting in this particular area here in the MPA, in the Eastern Seaboard, you might meet up with a traditional healer, Zulu healer, Isangoma, and they would know a lot of information about the bulbous plants of that region and a lot of information about the barks that are actually used that are obtained from the different forests of this particular area. And this information might be very different from the Xhosa healers, for instance, Amagqirha, who are found in the lower parts of the MPA. And these knowledge systems are also somehow quite different to what's happening down here in the Western Cape, where you have the succulent Karoo and the Cape floristic region. And the way in which plants are used is different. The species that are used is also different. And just to give you an idea, there are about 4,000 to 5,000 species or so in Southern Africa that are important to people for health purposes. And that interaction connects people with their cultures, it connects them with their history, and it's an important facet of spirituality as it connects them to their ancestors. And much of this plant use is often with plants that are actually taken from the wild. And the bush doctors, for example, feel that it is connecting them to their San and Kwekwe ancestry, which somehow was violated during the times of apartheid, because the utilization of medicinal plants in South Africa was actually outlawed. Okay, so what about the different types of trades that actually exist, because any place that has such cultural diversity of plants and people is a place that is going to be an inspiration for medicinal plant economies. There are two types of trades, the informal trade and the formal trade. The informal trade services about 27 million consumers or more. You have collectors that go into wild areas that then bring plants into urban centers, and they sell this to the traditional healers who then sell it to consumers. And that value chain services a lot of people, and this is critical for their livelihood. It is also perpetuated as a tradition because there are more traditional healers in South Africa than there are actually medical doctors. However, there's a growing formal trade, and plants like Aspalathus linearis, rooibos, and Pelargonium sedoides that's utilized to manufacture this cold and flu treatment are very big players in the formal trade of medicinal plants. But that formal trade of medicinal plants has many opportunities in terms of its growth in the bioeconomy if it is able to exploit the indigenous knowledge systems that are available, and at the same time be able to add scientific information into the plants that are actually there. So I want to now to start bringing along some plants that I actually work on. And the first one that I'm actually going to bring up is Scaletium, and give a little bit about the history in terms of the way this plant is actually used and how we have ended up with commercialized extracts of Scaletium. So this particular species has been important to the San people for centuries as a stimulant for happiness. And at the same time, it has been very important for hunger and thirst, and also to alleviate anxiety. Around about 1685, Simon van der Stel, who took a trip to Namaqualand, recorded this particular species as being important and having potential contributions in the economy of South Africa, when he noted that the local indigenous people were very much euphoric in terms of celebration, and they were consuming this particular species. In the 1970s, this plant and the alkaloids that it contains was studied actually for the first time from a scientific chemistry basis. And much of that work progressed into ethnobotany, which was only around about the mid-90s. And ultimately, some pharmacology was conducted in terms of the research profile. And this has led to some clinical studies that have also generated much information in terms of this particular species, Scaletium, being used as an antidepressant. So it has neuropsychological effects and psychiatric effects as well. And in my laboratory, we utilize a range of different ways in which to study medicinal plants. And I'm going to give a few examples today about some of those. But I just want us to understand that much of our work actually interacts with the ecology of the plants themselves. We try and understand how these plants live in their natural environments, so we can construct meaningful questions around their conservation, around the chemical diversity that they actually hold, and even potential problems related to climate change that we might be able to answer by looking at the chemistry. We also utilize cultivation as a conservation strategy, so that future generations may still have access to these medicinal plants. And last but not least, we use a wide range of very sophisticated technologies that allow us to be able to understand what is happening at the plant level, the tissue level, and ultimately at the cellular level in terms of the biochemistry of these plants. So ladies and gentlemen, I think it's time for me to start talking about some of these plants so that you can actually get to know them. And the first one that I'm bringing up is Sciletium. Okay, so Sciletium totosum. I have it right here. And this particular species has got these wonderful white flowers, and it actually happens to be a very soft succulent. I think it feels like velvet. And it has very characteristic leaves that sometimes end up becoming skeletonized. So I'm just bringing this closer to the camera, and hence its name of Sciletium. So this succulent, which is often hiding underneath other shrubs and is quite elusive in the wild, has got these key mesomarine alkaloids that allow for the brain to function. And we have been utilizing a range of strategies to study these plants. And some of the strategies that I'm going to talk about are integrated to the work that Kaylin Reddy, who happens to be a PhD student in my group, has been developing for this particular species and other sister species of this taxon. So we have been interested in understanding the metabolites, and that basically is the pool of compounds or chemicals that are inside the cell or the plant body. And we are able to see what this cocktail of metabolites actually is. We've also been utilizing a rather sophisticated technique trying to characterize as many of these components that are inside Sciletium as possible. And this is known as molecular networking. And what this allows you to be able to learn is whether one chemical is actually related to another chemical and how far that relationship is, what the distance of that relationship actually is. And last but not least, Kaylin has been utilizing a molecular docking system using computational biology tools, trying to simulate the brain and taking the structures of these chemicals and placing them inside the receptor to see if they would actually bind. And this has meant that we've gone out to all kinds of interesting places here in the Western Cape, trying to find these species so that we are able to move them from nature and hopefully to the pharmacy shelf. And they're actually quite difficult to distinguish because they all look very similar. Rigidum, on the other hand, is an upright species, and it occurs as very, very small populations that are tucked away in the Karoo and very localized. It also is quite beautiful because it has these idioblasts, which are water holding pockets that allow for these plants to be able to withstand long periods of drought in the semi-arid areas where they actually live. And so we utilize chemistry somehow to be able to understand the relationships of the populations of these plants and the relationships that may actually occur from one species to another species. And what's quite interesting is that sometimes plants that are found within the same population actually have slightly different chemistry. And species that are happening to be the same in different populations may have exceedingly variable levels. And some species might even hold unique metabolites, which we don't actually know well thus far. And so by utilizing these sophisticated molecular networking technologies, we are able also to be able to focus in not only on the mesembrine alkaloids that happen to be the major alkaloids of Scaletium, but also the minor alkaloids, urobatamines, Scaletium A4, which accumulate at very minor concentration in these plants. And these networks that we are able to draw allow us to hopefully be able to better characterize the cocktail of metabolites that are within these plants. And so now I want to talk a little bit about this in silico analysis that we have been doing, where we have been looking at the diversity of compounds that are found in Scaletium. And what's really interesting is that for a long time, everybody thought that mesembrine is the main bioactive compound. But when we do these studies where the compounds that actually have the green structure happen to be the minor alkaloids, we find that sometimes they actually bind to the different computational receptors that we use for the study much better. And so it's quite likely that dihydroeubatamine might actually relieve anxiety much more than mesembrine, for example, which doesn't bind as effectively to these receptors. So for a long time, people focused on the major alkaloids, but we think that it's important to focus on the minor alkaloids as well and focus on some of these other species, except for Scaletium tortuosum, that have not been well studied. Because this particular plant has actually become quite important as a commercialized drug, but at the same time, this particular species is becoming quite popular as a recreational agent, and this, of course, might be causing a biodiversity concern. And so it's important to find ways in which to protect that biodiversity. We've also been utilizing similar practices of looking at the chemistry to understand how these plants actually develop. And what's interesting is that some parts of the leaves may hold much higher concentration of a group of compounds in comparison to other parts of the plant body. For example, mesembrine is occurring at variable levels as those skeletonizing leaves actually age. And the stems hold high amounts of mesembrine. Why is this significant? This is significant because the way in which this species is used in traditional medicine is that it is collected as a whole, pulled out, crushed and ground, and all the plant parts are actually integrated together, and a cocktail of medicine is actually made. And so I think the work that we've been doing is adding a new value to this kind of information, because we can actually validate the rationale for using the whole entire plant, because each leaf segment actually has different chemistry. We've also been quite interested and fascinated about how to study medicinal plants in the context of climate change, because medicinal plants are so important to so many people for primary health care. And so we've been utilizing a variety of stress conditions using a tissue culture system, which in itself is an important cultivation practice. And for this particular study, we actually used a change in nutrients and a change in salts to see how these plants would respond when you have a situation that they need to be planted in other areas, or you have a situation where you have a drought and suddenly the level of salt stress actually increases for the plant itself. What's quite interesting is that when we change the salt conditions and we add high levels of salt, sometimes some of the compounds that are actually important are no longer being produced by the plant. We think that it's quite important for us to dig deep into this kind of analysis and try and understand different environmental stresses, because with climate change, plants are going to become more stressed, and they can either respond to this by making more toxic compounds, or else they can respond to this by not making these health beneficial metabolites. And for Scaletium, for example, much of the proteins that are actually changing happen to be critical proteins that drive primary growth and development of the plant. And these proteins are actually changing when the plants are stressed. And so now I want to turn to Sutherlandia frutescens, which is a totally different species to the one that I showed you before. And this one happens to be a legume. And it has these bright red flowers that actually dry into a much paler pink, and seed pods that actually hold black seeds. This particular species is called kankerbos, and this is known as cancer bush in English. And again, it has a very long tradition of plant use by the Kwekwe and the San people. And it's used throughout South Africa in places where it actually occurs. It's not only important as an anti-cancer agent, but it's also utilized as an immune boosting extract or tincture. And some people actually make a tea out of these very bitter leaves of Sutherlandia. Sutherlandia contains a wide variety of interesting metabolites. And because it's so important for this wide range of ailments, it is being grown at a small scale, but often wild collections are also used to increase biomass. So we have done an extensive study where we looked at different populations that are occurring in different environments that have very different environmental conditions and soil types. And what was really interesting is that depending on where the plants are actually collected, the pharmacological activity, the biological activity actually changes. So if one is intending to commercialize Sutherlandia as an anti-cancer agent, they would need to collect plants that are actually coming from the areas of Colesberg and Zastron. But if one is planning on commercializing this species for its antioxidant potential, then one needs to collect from the coastal areas of the southern of the Overberg, such as Gansbaai and Pearly Beach. And again, we used another stress experiment where we actually changed the nutrient profile for this particular species. And what was interesting is that many of the amino acids, which are thought to be important for this immune boosting effect, were also actually changed. And so this gives us inputs into how these plants are actually reacting, and that their biological activity could potentially be changed under different conditions of stress. And this is a very sophisticated network of biosynthesis that involves a whole bunch of enzymes, a whole bunch of metabolites that actually ultimately leads to the key acting compounds, which are called sutherlandiosides. And any changes to the basic building blocks of the plant, so the central metabolites, this ultimately has an influence also on the key secondary metabolites or specialized metabolites, which are known to have anti-cancer activity, for example. I'm now going to launch into my last example. This would be Dodonaea viscosa. And this particular species is also quite wonderful. I call it the globe trotter, as it is found in different parts of the world. This particular plant is found in Asia. It's found in other parts of Africa, such as Kenya, for example. It's also found in India, in China, and it is thought to have originated from Australia. This particular species is a very important medicinal plant that is part of the Cape Bush Doctor cocktail of plants that are used for health. And they believe that these plants have got power and that they give you iron strength. And at one time, they alluded to that different plants that are found in different environments in the wild have got different activity. And so we were interested in understanding this notion by the bush doctors. So we went out and collected plants from 3 different environments. And then we did some anti-cancer analysis together with Prof Annemart Engelbrecht, who happens to be a human physiologist on our campus. And that research was largely driven by the group of Cape Bush doctors who have organized themselves into an organization known as the Cape Bush Doctors Organization. And they gave us quite deep information. So if you utilize a handful and you make a tea and then you drink this, this would be very beneficial for your health and also assist in boosting the immune system. What was really interesting with this study is that these plants from different places had different anti-cancer activity, but what was also quite fascinating is that the animals that were actually taking this cocktail of plants were much more healthy than those that were taking the chemotherapy that is known as doxorubicin. So we think that Dodonaea viscosa or sand olive might become a very important herbal agent which can assist with various cancer treatments. And what's interesting is that it also prevents the migration of the cancer to other areas of the body. So this is really an exciting project for us. And as a result, we've gone out with Ms. Hoffman, who is now doing a PhD in my lab, and collected again from different places. And we have been cultivating these plants. And some of these plants actually got locked down with me when we couldn't get into the glass houses. And what's interesting is that whether the plants are collected from the wild or they're collected from a cultivation or a common garden experiment, the metabolite patterns amongst the different populations that we have assayed look the same. In other words, the cedarburg plants are still sitting on the top part of this very complicated graph, whereas the plants from the De Hoop and the Stellenbosch areas are sitting on the bottom part of this rather complicated graph. And it seems that whether it's they're under cultivation, these patterns in terms of their metabolite profile still remain. We've also been doing a genetic analysis, and what's interesting again is that the metabolites actually mirror the genetic analysis, where the Stellenbosch population and the De Hoop population seem to be very much similar, whereas the Cederberg population seem to be very unique. And so we think that it is very important to be able to study plants from this angle, use a range of different tools so that we can actually mine new information that not only is of scientific value, but it also validates and adds value to the indigenous knowledge systems that we have here in South Africa. And I'm just going to show these plants again that I showed earlier on, that we've been working on the Scaletium tortuosum and related Scaletium species that has this anti-anxiolytic activity and antidepressant activities. And these plants, some of them are found in many different biomes and are very important for mental health.
Prof, may I ask, before you show the rest of them, can you perhaps, if you're finished with the presentation, if you could just stop sharing, then we can see them larger on the screen.
Sure. Okay, and then Sutherlandia, and I'll bring that up again if you would like to take another look at this. And I have one or two other medicinal species that I've brought along, and I would like to talk a little bit about them. And so with that, I would like to thank you for your attention and the very many people that I actually work with. And this work is not done alone. It's done with a variety of different people. These would be international collaborators, local collaborators, and many other people are engaged in the activities that I conduct in my laboratory. Funding agents such as the National Research Foundation. And at the same time, I would like to thank and honor the people who have carried this knowledge from one generation to another generation, past many different centuries, who sometimes are regarded as having information that might not necessarily be scientific, and I say that in inverted commas. And the traditional healers, the medicine men, the medicine women, the shaman, the herbalists, inyanga, amagriha, sangoma, I would like to thank these people for keeping this knowledge alive so that in the present time, I can make it my life's work, and hopefully in the future, it may be available for those that come in contact with these precious plants that are found here in South Africa. So with this, I think I'm going to stop sharing my screen and get out of this PowerPoint so that I can show a little bit more of these plants that are important. And I am ready for questions, and I do have some plants here, and I'm happy to answer any questions that might have come around whilst I was giving this presentation. I had a question. What was that one species that you shared? I'm trying to find this here now. And I think that was collected in De Hoop, and it is this one here. I don't know if you can see this, but it's got these rather spindly looking kind of leaves, which have got a little bit of a leaf residue that's actually got saponins. So if you take them fresh, you often get your mouth to get a little bit fuzzy, and from these soapy chemicals that are actually sitting there. So it was this Dodonaea viscosa species, this one here, and that is the one that was actually collected in De Hoop, but we also collected from Stellenbosch as well as the cinnamon.
Thank you,
And this is the one that we think we will commercialize as an anti-cancer agent. And then I have another wonderful species here. And I don't know if you guys know this one. I would think that many people would easily recognize this particular one. I think this is probably one of South Africa's most popular medicinal plants. And it locally goes by the name of Impepo or Helichrysum, and there are many different Helichrysum species. It's got a wonderful cocktail of essential oils. So as I'm rubbing these leaves, I'm actually releasing those oils, and those oils also act on the central nervous system, and they give you the sense of calm. So this is a species that will always be found in a religious ceremony that is associated with African traditional medicines, where people burn this as an incense to bring a good energy to the space and also to bring calm to the situation. And they say that it can be given to babies to put them to sleep, to make them relax. And at the same time, this is a very important plant that used to actually be a mattress for the San who traversed the lands of Southern Africa. So they would use this as a mattress, and it also has insecticidal effects. And then I went into my garden, and I have some very fresh leaves of a sage here. I've got a bit of a terrible sinus infection, and I actually love to utilize this particular sage. It's called Salvia africana caerula, or some people just call it Salvia caerula, or it's a wild sage. We have about 26 South African sages that are indigenous, and many of these are used for respiratory infections. And I, at this time, suffer quite a lot from sinusitis. And if I have congestion, I will often get some leaves out of the garden, place this under the pillow, and then lie over it. And while I do that, this actually heats up the leaves and releases the essential oils. And then I get a wonderful sense of calm as well from this, because it can be quite calming. But at the same time, this allows for my congestion to actually go away. You can take this species and make a tea, and you can utilize it for treating bronchial and respiratory infections. It also makes a wonderful a herb for culinary purposes, and can also be utilized for cooking, and particularly very nice with meat. So these are some of the plants that I collected for this particular talk, and I am willing to answer questions if there are questions that are available.
Prof, thank you very, very much for the fantastic presentation. We would now like to invite our audience to please go ahead and ask questions. You can use the reaction tools at the bottom to indicate that you would like to ask a question, or you can wildly wave your hand or attract our attention in some way. You can also ask questions in the chat, and we might deal with some of the questions in the chat first. I see Prof Brad Nelson has got his hand up, so let's ask him to unmute and ask the question.
Okay, thank you. First of all, wonderful talk. Very, very interesting. I love the part about the cultural meldings and how this knowledge comes together. I think that was really interesting. So I mean, I have a lot of questions. One of the things I was curious to me though was on your cancer drug, about how you go through regulatory processes there, patenting and these kinds of issues. What are the challenges? I mean, I work in the medical device industry, so it's clear there, but I'm wondering how that works with medicinal plants and what your for want of a better word, business opportunities there. How do you protect yourself? How do you market? How do you do the regulatory? And how does this work in that sense?
So there are definite regulatory processes that need to be followed. And South Africa actually has a Biodiversity Act, and it stipulates that any bioprospecting work has to also be shared in terms of benefits with the original knowledge holder. And if the original knowledge holder is not known, then with a group or a community of people that are actually associated with that knowledge. And so in my particular instance, I work together with the Cape Bush doctors through this organization. And the idea here is to actually ultimately commercialize this agent together so that they can actually derive economic benefits from this. But there are different acts. So it would be the Biodiversity Act that one needs to think about, and the Department of Environmental Affairs and Fisheries in South Africa is also managing that particular process. There are also regulations where to move this into a from to the pharmacy shelf, one would actually need to follow the South African SAPRA, which is the South African regulatory body. And I suppose this would be similar in context to some of the functions of the FDA, for example. And so there is definite legislation that's there to protect the people and also to assist with commercializing medicinal plants, but making sure that these herbal medicines are ultimately safe and non-toxic. I hope that satisfies your question.
Thank you, Johan.
Thank you. Johan, you were muted.
You're on mute.
Sorry, that's a rookie mistake. I see Khomotso Morake's hand is up. Please go ahead. Thank you very much.
Hi, Prof. I just wanted to ask, is there a specific family or taxonomic group in which the plants that have anti-cancerous chemicals or activities, is it concentrated in a specific taxonomic group or family, or is it just spread out?
In general. Khomotso, it's lovely to have you here. It's been a little while.
It's been a long while.
We've been together because it was always lovely to have you in my class. That's a great question. And plants have got two groups of compounds or classes of compounds. These are called phenolics, and then the terpenoids. And these often hold anti-cancer activity. And even the alkaloids, some alkaloids are also very much anti-cancerous, such as Taxol. And the distribution of these groups of compounds that I've just mentioned now is not necessarily stuck to one particular taxa. It's actually throughout the whole entire plant kingdom. So it becomes quite difficult then to be able to pinpoint plants from a taxonomic basis that might potentially hold anti-cancer activity. And so what people generally do is that they would screen a whole range of plants from a particular group or family to see if they actually hold any anti-cancer activity. And Indigenous knowledge is usually a very good guide of which species might actually have that kind of activity. And while I'm talking about this Indigenous knowledge, there was a question that alluded to, are there other animals that are also utilizing medicinal plants? And actually, we think that the way in which plants are being used, in some instances, we actually learned from other animals. So if we could see that, primates are interacting with a particular species and it's not killing them, then we would also go there and actually try it for ourselves and see an experiment to see how we actually respond to it. And yes, there are other animals that will often, if they are sick, then they'll start to gravitate towards actually eating a particular set of plants that might actually be beneficial to them.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you for the talk as well.
It's a pleasure.
Thanks, Prof. Marty. You held back for long enough. Go for it, please.
Great, thanks very much. Thanks, Professor Makunga. I was very excited to hear about your talk because I've had the privilege of doing a medicinal plants course in the Kruger Park with the Oni Rangers with David Lovell. So it wasn't as technical as some of the things that you presented this evening. So it was further learning, and it was great. So I think the one sort of thing that I wanted to just ask is, there's almost a fine balance between is the sort of understood solution to try and learn from the plants and almost synthesize these same chemicals through chemical processes to produce the drugs, or is the ideal to actually continue growing the plants sustainably without them being depleted in the environment to produce the chemicals? You did allude to the economic well-being of the people who hold the knowledge, and I agree that's a very important part. But I think if there's overutilization because it becomes this amazing drug that everyone can use, that also doesn't help the biodiversity. So there's almost like a tipping point where you need to almost synthesize the chemicals through another process. But again, that is quite crazy because it can cost millions to do that, whereas the tree just grows there on its own and it doesn't cost anything. So yeah, that whole side of it, if you could maybe elaborate a bit on.
Sometimes it's impossible to utilize full chemical synthesis. It's just not possible because these plants will make very complicated structures. With this Dodonaea, for example, one of the compounds that has been isolated from this has got about 5 different ring structures to its chemistry. And that makes it impossible for a synthetic chemist to ever manufacture something like that. They might be able to use it as a scaffold and tag on and alter 1 or 2 things there, but there's no way that they'd be able to synthesize the whole thing. We just don't have that kind of technology. But what we can do is exploit biotechnology as a way to manufacture these plants. There's a possibility to grow them in tissue culture, where you're actually growing it, at large scale, so that you can actually have access to the material. There's even tissue culture technologies that allow you to be able to grow it in a large tank, similarly to the way in which you make beer. And so use a bioreactor to actually manufacture these compounds. And there are other medicinal plants, compounds, Taxol, which is an anti-cancer agent that comes from Taxus brevifolia, for example. Much of that drug is actually generated via tissue culture. So there are ways in which we can avoid going into nature and harvesting for commercial industries.
Well, cool.
And
Thanks.
I think there's an opportunity for South Africa to actually grow these plants and better understand them as crops, so that they, can generate another revenue stream for people that are actually interested in horticultural aspects of actually growing these plants.
And then just the other side that I've always found very interesting is that the plants themselves are actually producing a lot of these chemicals to actually protect themselves. So they in essence are poisons to try and protect them against insects or other animals. And if you think about it, that's exactly what cancer treatment is. It's poison to kill the multiplying cells of cancer. So yeah, it's from the actual plants themselves. They put it there as protection, but it's actually helping us as medicine. So yeah, but thank you very much. It was very, very interesting.
That's very true. And this guy here, the Scaletium, is an absolute favorite somehow, I think, for some herbivores. And when the Karoo is pretty dry and there's nothing else there, if it gets exposed, it does get munched. So, and we have seen leaves that have been, they look like they were actually eaten. So I think what you say is absolutely spot on.
Thanks.
Thank you, Prof. Alistair, thank you very much for assisting us this year with the questions and answers. If you can see anything happening in the chat, please go for it before we ask Dr. Llewellyn Taylor to ask his question.
Sure, thanks, Johan. Prof, I've got a question here from Sabine Ridmiller saying, wow, to your quiver tree in the beginning of the presentation. Is the quiver tree related to the dragon blood tree of Scotra Island? They look very similar.
I absolutely am not sure about that, but it was originally grouped they were actually regarded as aloes. They are actually, a type of aloe, and that would be the family Azeoaceae. So I'm not sure if that particular species belongs to that particular group of plants.
Okay, cool. And then a statement by Claudia Roth saying, your talk was incredibly interesting. You talk about the people who found and used those plants. Do you get any information as well from other animals other than Homo sapien or humans, as we are not the only ones to use medicinal plants? And that reflects on Marty's question that he just had that conversation now.
Yes. And I think I answered that as well when I was talking with Humutso, and I see there in that chat there's another comment that's related to this from Barbara Sarvena, who just said that apparently in the North Americas, the native people might have actually learned from bears. I think that's a very interesting fact. That's fascinating. Thank you so much for sharing that.
There's a question here from Adam Parker as well saying, do you know if there has been an increase or decrease in the use of medicinal plants in South Africa in recent years? And what age groups are the main consumers of these medicinal plants?
That's a really interesting question. And if, I think it seems to always be changing and to be quite dynamic. The way in which people are using plants it's never static. It's always changing. And I think in this past year, as a result, or past 2 years now, as a result of this pandemic, there really has been an explosion of medicinal plant use, as people have been trying to assist themselves with, if they got sick, and even trying to protect themselves in terms of infections with regards to the coronavirus. And there has also been a large interest in South African medicinal plants. People are wanting to know about them. And that, I think, again, in the last 2 years has been spurred on by, facing something that we knew very little about. And any plants that would help became popular. Artemisia afra, got into the news, and it's only now that we actually have the evidence in its effects in vitro on the replication of coronaviruses. And I think there has been an interest, and this is actually it's a global trend. And in both streams, the formal sector and the informal sectors, people are wanting to consume natural products. We are turning somehow to more natural ways of healing. And I think part of this is because we have been extracted from nature. We live in apartments. We might not have access to go to parks for walks. And some of these elements are actually just generally driving an interest in plants per se, and trends that are actually related to plant use. So I think that there is definitely an increase, and it's not necessarily a decreasing. And for some species, this might actually cause a lot of pressure if those plants are collected in the wild and there's no other alternative source for them.
Thanks very much, Prof. Dr. Llewellyn Taylor has a question. He is unmuted. Over to you, Dr. Llewellyn.
Good evening again. Professor Makunga, a more specific question. The sour fig, which is Copper Brotus edulis, has your group worked on that? Because it's sympatrically distributed with Scaletium in the Western Cape, and also it's basically used for mouth and throat infections. Has your group done any work on sour figs?
This is Copper Brotus.
Yeah.
No, we haven't been. It's quite interesting. In the last 2-3 weeks, everyone's been asking me loads of questions about Copper Brotus edulis. And in my group, we haven't been working on that particular species at all. There was a time when we were trying to acquire some funding together with some European scientists to look at it actually from, because it is a problem in other parts of the world. It's an invasive, and we were going to have a collaborative project that was going to look at Copper Brotus, and we were going to try and understand its chemistry, etc., and then also look at its genetic diversity. But this is a species that I haven't been working on. The only species from the Mesobranthomiaceae that I work on actually happens to be Scaletium. And part of that is driven by the fact that this has already been a commercialized plant, but there's still many questions that are unanswered in terms of generally how it actually functions in the wild.
Yeah, it's quite interesting because Copper Brotus edulis and Scaletium, the Tortuosum, they are sympatrically distributed in the Western Cape, and they're both from the same family. So it would be quite interesting to have a look at the differences between the two with respect to their biochemistry.
The mesembrine alkaloids are actually quite restricted in their distribution. So these are the ones from Scaletium. So that group of compounds is only really found in the Scaletium species.
Okay.
Coprobrotus has other compounds, but it's quite interesting with alkaloid diversity. It's often, one or two taxa within a family that might actually have alkaloids. They're very sparsely distributed within the plant kingdom. A lot of the other compounds, the phenolics and the terpenes, are found in all plants. All plants have phenolics, and terpenoids are also quite wild, have a wide distribution, but alkaloids can really be restricted. It's quite fascinating from an evolutionary perspective how this actually came about.
Great, thank you very much.
Thank you, Prof. I'm just noticing that a portion of our audience is going to bed at the moment. And I just want to give Chris the opportunity to say a few words, and then we might head back to some of the questions in the chat. Thank you. Chris?
Thank you, Johan. Just want to mention there's a very interesting question by Notile in the chat that we should address. At this point, I would like just to arrange that everybody can unmute themselves. You and Alistair still facilitate the questions. I'm around. But again, to Professor Makunga, I think this is something to be taken further. I think it's fascinating. Maybe we should also at a point see how we can find some international support for what you are doing. But just from our side, I again repeat, we've lived by the knowledge of the so-called non-scientific people who are the real scientists in all this. And I'm so thankful that through your own life, your own traditions, your ancestors, that you have explored this and you're studying this and making a difference. And thanks for tonight. I think we can just unmute everybody and give a lovely round of applause. Thank you so much. Then to also just want to say to everyone for having joined us through the year, we thank you, and we want to wish you all a beautiful Christmas season or festive season and a beautiful new year. We hope that you will all be back in the new year on the, what's the date you're on? The 11th? 13th of January. But we thank you and we wish you just the best. And from the LCA family, lovely to see all of you, and we look forward to a great new year. So over to you, Johan, and also to Alistair to handle the chats, and everybody can unmute themselves. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chris. Alistair, you are welcome to handle that very well put question from Nomatile Nombewu. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Johanna. I'll get there. I just want to go through some of the questions before so that I don't miss anything above that. I just wanted to report from Guillaume Dodonaea, and I hope I've pronounced his name correctly or her name correctly. Soctra, the dragon blood tree, is Dracaena cinnabara, and it's from the Liliaceae family. And then there's a question from Corlia Shigan, and it is there a favored digital resource that can be used in getting further information on medicinal plants, Prof?
Yes, my favorite is Plants Africa, and that's linked to Sanbi. They have an incredible repository of plants that are very useful. So Plants with a Z or a Z, Africa, and it's a Sanbi resource, and I think that's a fantastic one. If there's something that I've, that I'm looking for, I often go and like check out facts there. I find that to be extremely useful. And it's very easy to use. They even have tips on gardening, and there's a little bit about, a little bit about evolution of the plants, medicinal uses, gardening. It's a fantastic digital resource.
Thanks very
May I
much.
say something? I see I'm unmuted. Sandra Hardy. Yeah. Sorry, I don't know why I've got any problems with my communication tonight. Professor, I have to thank you for this absolutely wonderful talk. It was so exciting because I have treated horses with sarcoids very successfully with Sutherlandia frutescens. I've always been fascinated how the ponies and cows and donkeys on our farm graze often on Sutherlandia. And I have just spoken to a friend whose horse has a squamous carcinoma in the eye. And I have actually suggested to her that she use Sutherlandia. And I'm interested in your other plants as well. So I wondered how she could get in touch with you, because I think it could be such valuable information for treating animals.
I'm very easy to get hold of. It's just my surname at sun.ac.za. I'm going to pop that into this chat here quickly.
Okay, I don't have a.
And I'm also, it's very easy to get hold of me. I'm trying to see. I think I said that. Okay. So there it is. It's very easy to get hold of me. If you go and Google my name on the internet, it's either my cousin that's going to come up, and she's a medical doctor, Tuma, or else it will be me. But also interesting, now I'm going to deviate. If you Google Makunga and you don't put any other names there, the first thing that comes up is Makunga the lion from Madagascar 2. And then the rest follows.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you. I'm going to get her to do that. Thank you. And thank you, team, for my book. I'm very, very excited about my book. And thank you for the wonderful lectures you've given this year. Good night.
Thank you, Sandra.
Okay. So should I answer Nomadila's question? I'm happy to.
Prof, we can get there now. I'd like to just get through the other questions that are before Nomadila's question. So, okay. Prof Wolf Dieter Stroll writes nice books on traditional healing herbs, myths related to herbs, learning from animals, etc. in Europe. And Barbara Savina has this question. Were there any specific plants that you could help us with identifying that could assist in treating COVID-19?
That I could identify in treating COVID-19. At the beginning of this, I kind of had a few that I thought would be very interesting to test for antiviral activity. And one of them would be Tilbalgia violacea or capensis, but I would, prefer to go with violacea, just wild garlic, just because that particular species has shown such strong antimicrobial activity in bioassays before. It has obviously sulfur-containing compounds because it's a type of garlic. It's pretty much in just about everybody's garden. And some of the assays that we've done looking at its antimicrobial activity, it's exceedingly potent against, fungi, for example, against Candida. It's really, really potent. So I think that would be an interesting one to test. as well. Much stronger than just the regular garlic that we put in our food. I think that would be an interesting one. And often it's the bulb that's actually extracted and utilized, but all the different plant parts make similar compounds. It's just that the bulbs hold more or a more concentration of these sulfur containing compounds. I think that species would be quite an interesting one to test.
Thank you. Okay, so now we go on to the question that everybody has been waiting for from Nomatile. In terms of the beliefs from the traditional healers, how do they view the issue of cultivating medicinal plants as opposed to getting them in the wild? The Inyanga is believed to seek guidance of an ancestral spirit before embarking on a collecting trip through dreams. How do they view an option of cultivating these medicinal species to reduce pressure from collecting from the wild? And before we go into answering that question, I also just want to park a little asterisk there and say, are you aware of the pepperbark tree that has been run as a project out of the Kruger National Park due to pressures from traditional healers? And as a result, we do cultivate pepperbark trees now in Kruger for distribution. Thank you, Prof.
Okay, thank you so much for this question. This is always a very difficult one, and you know, we often have to find the balance in terms of allowing people access to areas where they feel connected to nature, and you know, conducting practices that they've conducted for centuries, and it's also important to highlight that when something starts to become rare, when you can't get it anymore, when it's scarce, and you have to pay a high price for it to be able to get access to it, cultivation becomes a very effective option. And I say this because, you know, with wild ginger, for example, for Sapphonochyllus, there was a project where a group of traditional healers were actually cultivating this because it is more expensive for them to be able to purchase this, and it is very rare, so they can't get it. So that becomes a real option. And we've been doing we did another study with Casper Duplessis, where we actually spoke to the Rastafarian Cape bush doctors throughout the Western Cape about the ideas about conservation and how they see conservation and whether they would embark on cultivation. And it was quite interesting because there are certain species, they say, yes, I love to collect this from the wild, but now I'm not getting it anymore. And some of these plants, being Tulbachia capensis, heavily extracted, but at the same time, we've placed a whole bunch of urban developments, you know, all over the Western Cape, especially in the Blouberg area. There's new developments, so those populations that used to be there are gone. And so this is a species that they often have in their gardens, and somehow they understand how to cultivate it and wait for it until it has more power. So I think, yes, the idea of being guided through dreams to be able to access plants is important. And this often will happen with plants that are most likely available. But when things start to become rare, there's a shift in the position and even in people's perspectives about whether they should access it from the wild or not. If you can't get it and cultivation is your only option, you would much rather than go for the option of actually getting it as a cultivated medicinal. And in terms of the barks, it's, this is a very controversial topic with regards to whether people should be allowed to just harvest bark, or should there be, training. And we also need to realize that this industry has people who actually are quite conservative in their practices, and these are usually the people that are sitting at the end of that chain. But the collectors and the gatherers, the guys that go out and get material and then they go and sell it to somebody else, aren't always conservative. And so, it's cheaper to, go there, get as much as you can and get out without being caught, for one. And, poach in the middle of the night. It can be, sometimes I think these are issues that people are facing. And then also they're there to make the money, and not necessarily as practitioners that have the philosophy or the idea that they are healing other people. And so they're never really conservative in their practice. I know Kurt Geldenhuys has got different ideas about whether, people should have access, and in forest areas particularly, that the forests are actually regenerable, and we've always interacted with plants in the wild, and that be able to regenerate. I think what's important is to monitor, to monitor the situation if people are harvesting and planting. I think to provide the scientific evidence is important. So I'm glad that you guys have a project in Kruger that is planting the trees, and hopefully that might actually alleviate a little bit of the pressure that these trees are actually facing, the Warburgias.
Yeah. Thanks very much, Prof. The project has so far been very successful, and got quite a lot of buy-in from the traditional healers around the park, which has relieved quite a lot of the pressure on those trees, the natural populations inside of the park. Yeah. So I think that we can put down to a good conservation success story.
That sounds wonderful.
Are there any other questions? There's no questions that I've picked up in the chat. Is there anybody else that would like to ask any questions? It's approaching that time of the evening where we could, Brad Nelson would like to ask another question. I'm going to ask you to unmute.
I had a couple of questions. First of all, I saw you had University of Minnesota on your first page. Were you there, based there for a while, or what?
Yes, I was there as a Fulbright scholar in 2017 and 2018.
Okay.
And I had a very cold winter.
I was going to say, do you miss the winters? That's what I was going to ask you. So
very different from anything that I've ever experienced in my life. And I took and I did a study actually that was looking at some of the aspects related to skeletonium. Okay. So even the plants themselves also had a cold winter, but luckily they had a very cozy growth room. They didn't even realize that they were not even at home.
No, I was a professor there for 4 years and then moved here, but that was a long time ago. But one of the questions, I was just down in the Tin Swallow Hospital, just outside of Kruger, and we were talking to doctors about how we might do a better job of handling stroke patients, and it opened my eyes to realize a lot of people show up late with their symptoms because they go to the traditional healers first, whereas there's a very clear treatments for this, but the longer you wait, the worse you get. So it seems to me there's got to be a way to bring together the traditional and the more modern in a positive way. I mean, in a way that's mutually beneficial, so that people aren't, doing the wrong thing in the wrong place. What are your issues? What are your views on that? I'm curious.
I think this is an excellent idea. And I think the medical doctors as well should be learning a little bit more about traditional medicine so that they can understand the impacts of medical pluralism, because we all try and help ourselves first before we go to the doctor. I certainly do. And this can cause problems because there can be drug-herb interactions that are just unknown. And as you say that, you know, people may present very late, and often, you know, a lot of sometimes diseases like, you know, like strokes, neurological diseases, there are sometimes beliefs in within local quarters that you know, this is something that has been burdened to me by somebody else, you know, cast a spell kind of idea, or be wishing me badly, and so now I've ended up with this situation. And I think that is often one of the drivers. People end up going to the traditional healer first rather than going to the medical doctor, because they're thinking that this is something that a sangoma is going to be able to treat rather than a doctor. And I think there needs to be much more open conversations with both parties. And it would be wonderful one day to be able to see maybe a situation such as the one that prevails in places like China, where you have, you know, really modern hospitals, where you have traditional medicines being utilized. And I think that the South African government has had some of these ideas milling around in its head, but it's not easy to regulate an industry that's been unregulated for a very, very long time. And sometimes people feel like, you know, the way in which I use my herbs is linked to my ancestry, and I don't necessarily want to share this with other people.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. In Zurich, we have a lot of traditional Chinese medicine, you know, regular doctors that study it and offer it as a, I think there was even a Nobel Prize given, if I'm not mistaken, right? In China.
Yes. There
right?
was a Nobel for artemisinin.
Yeah, and it's really interesting, but it was eye-opening when I was at Tinswallow to see, you know, that these issues. I think it's quite interesting, and it's yeah, going to be a challenge to figure out how to bring these things together. Great, thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Brad. Are there any other questions in the room? We've got
Yes, Alistair, may I ask?
Yes. Dr. Taylor.
Yeah, good. I'm just curious, Professor Makunga. You know, in Indigenous ecological knowledge systems, beliefs cannot always easily be quantified. Let's say from a biochemical point of view, etc. And there's always the idea of trying to introduce the so-called Afrocentric scientific method, which is more qualitative as opposed to the Eurocentric form, which is more hypothetico-deductive. Do you, in the teaching at Stellenbosch, actually look at the possibility, or do you teach Afrocentric ways in which to deal with the scientific method as opposed to the normal, traditional, Eurocentric ones that we're all accustomed to?
Well, there's been lots of conversations about decolonizing the curriculum, right?
Yeah.
And, you know, I think different people on our campus visualize this in different ways. And so I am teaching mainly very much botanical courses, plant biochemistry, you know, and plant molecular biology, chemical diversity, and how medicinal plants actually evolved. I often try within this third year module, Khumutso, that was actually here, I don't know if she still is, introduce aspects of make it a little bit more Afrocentric. But it's quite difficult because it's a short module that is right at the edge of the semester. But there are other places in South Africa where they have, whole entire courses. There's a whole degree now in Indigenous knowledge systems that's available. But unfortunately, for me, I don't have as much room just because of the way that our course is actually structured.
Okay, thank you.
Great, thank you.
Just to add to that, I agree. It's only mentioned, well, there are some other modules that we have that speak about Indigenous knowledge systems and harvesting, but it's not incorporated as a big part of the module itself, or each of the modules.
Okay, thank you.
Great. I just want to refer to a point in the chat by Shamiso Mapura. There will be a link. We will be putting Prof's talk up on the YouTube page for the LCA, and you can go and see any one of the previous talks that we've had on the LCA as well on our YouTube channel. Are there any other questions for Prof Nox? I think everybody is able to unmute themselves, so you are more than welcome to have a conversation.
Yeah, I think I saw one, but maybe you managed to grab it. I've also been, checking out this chat here. There was something that I saw earlier, I think, but I've lost it.
Maybe while you're looking, while you're looking, if I can maybe just ask, do you ever almost see that this is going to become almost like a regulated kind of industry where for a branch of XYZ, it'll cost a set amount that's almost regulated like other medicines and other councils, or do you think it's still going to be sort of more informal type of arrangement?
I think both, you have the informal and you have the formal kind of running together. So you have this phytopharmaceutics, the products that you'll get at Clicks and Discam and whatnot. And then you kind of have this stuff. So, and they're running in parallel, and it's difficult to regulate the informal trade. It's just impossible because you don't even know, in places like KwaZulu-Natal at Warwick Junction, I mean, they have massive amounts of plants that have come from all over. And as there's even a transfer of plants between different provinces. So it is tough to regulate it. And then some people say that they're not really wanting to be prescribed to by the government because, they need to be able to express themselves and practice in a way that their ancestors practiced. So I think it's very tough to regulate. And because there's so many different ways and Indigenous knowledge systems, it's hard to use a one umbrella type solution for everybody. It's very tricky. I've sat in meetings where you've had traditional healers from different places, you've had government, you've had scientists, we're all trying to have conversations with each other. And sometimes it's very, very, very hard to find a common voice.
And then just the other thing, we've been discussing majority of plants because that was the topic of discussion. But I mean, there's the other side where it's not only plants, there's other elements that come in terms of muties and parts of different things that start becoming questionable.
Yeah, and even from the sea, there's, it's very different in character if you look at what's happening on the east side of South Africa to what happens down here. you find that it's a lot more, it's much smaller quantities. It's a lot more underground, but definitely on the eastern parts of South Africa, the informal trade is, it's explosive, it's huge. I would think that, Durban probably has the largest medicinal market in Africa. And then I think Nongoma as well is pretty big. And then Faraday is pretty big. Those markets are really large. And they have everything from all over, land and sea. And it's tough to regulate. It is tough to regulate that.
Yeah, so I mean, the sort of the question goes more around like when there's no regulation, some guy puts a little bit of battery acid in, another one puts a bit of another thing in another, and you start getting things that are very potentially harmful to the customers.
It happens, some people will make their things more potent, some people might, spike, a herbal mixture with a little bit of aspirin. And for somebody like me, who's highly allergic to aspirin, if I don't know that that's sitting there, that can be actually fatal. So yes, it happens. There's definitely adulterations that take place. And there are some researchers who actually try and study this aspect of adulterations, of polyherbal mixtures, of herbal mixtures with other things, other agents. There's Professor Ashwal Dlala. He's done quite a lot of work in this particular regard, where he's been looking at, mixtures of phytomedicines, and they can have all kinds of other things. It doesn't necessarily have to be plants.
Thank you.
Thanks, Marty. There's one last question, and then we're down to one screen. So that's usually the time that we cut off. But Abel, Erica has asked, I'd like to ask if you have done any study on collecting plants on specific moon cycles like full moon. There is I know a theory that if you harvest under certain moon cycles, specifically when it comes to timber, it's got a certain protection against termites or something along those lines.
Excuse me?
So the question was, have you has any study on collecting plants on specific moon cycles like full moon been done? And I know that there is some significance to this, because in the forestry industry, you can chop down a tree at a certain moon cycle, and then it doesn't need to go through like a CCA treatment.
Okay. This is a very interesting question. So it was quite difficult for me to choose which topics I would talk about in terms of my research, especially when it comes to skinny tin, because we've been collecting quite a large body of knowledge. And I actually took out the slides with the seasonal and influence of seasons, and where we've studied these plants, with the equinox. And so there is definitely something there in terms of variation at different times of the year. And we haven't done a study where we've looked at moon cycles, but plants are definitely influenced by everything, everything that is in their world has a potential to be able to influence the way they manufacture these very complicated chemicals that are produced through very sophisticated metabolism. So I think that would be a very interesting one. We have been looking at, together with the Cape Bush doctors, at putting in a biodynamic method for the Dodonaea. So we started doing a little bit of that work. And that's because they said that they wanted these plants, if they have to cultivate them for commercial purposes, they want them to be more, to feel a little bit more wild. They don't want them in rows. They want to grow them as intercropped, and they want to put in something like a biodynamic system, which would make them much more comfortable in cultivating them as an emergent crop. So I think that would be an interesting one. But seasons, we know that there's definitely variation, particularly with the Scaletium. And in spring, it starts to really ramp up. And then in the summer months, as these plants are starting to senesce, they really accumulate the highest amount of some of the key metabolites. But I took out those slides. I was like, I've got too much stuff that I'm talking about, and I'm going to run out of time. So let me pull this out.
You can see all the passionate ones are still here, so don't worry.
I think that the moral of the story is Johan and Chris, we're going to have to get Professor Nox back to come and talk to us about a different element in the subject matter, because I think that we could unpack this suitcase for quite a while.
That would be true.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think that's we can call it an evening. I'd like to once again, from my side, thank you very much, Professor Makunga, for your presentation this evening. There was a comment earlier on the evening by Graham Baldwin, who said he was sitting on the edge of his seat, and I think that you had quite a few of our participants this evening sitting on the edge of their seat with this fascinating talk. So thank you very much for presenting this evening.
It's an absolute pleasure. It's an absolute pleasure. It's been really fun. I wish I could have done it in person, so that you'd be able to also get a sense of goodness out of these goodies that I have here with me today. And hopefully one day it would be possible to maybe move into a hybrid platform where I can actually get to see people's faces while I present.
Certainly.
Get better soon.
Thank you. It's the Cape Spring. It gets me every year, and then they also spray the grapes, and that makes it worse.
Yeah.
So
Well,
you can come to
toxic.
Gauteng.
Thank you so much. Good night.
Yeah, thank you. And
Good
Gillip,
night.
I think there hasn't been any work done on the fractionation of or looking at mesobrine alone, but that is interest. It would be interesting to get into that. I think that was the one question that that I was thinking about that we might have actually missed.
Now, with Scaletium, there's a night and a day remedy. What is the difference between the night and day remedies of Scaletium?
It's a difference in these, I would say, these alkaloids. The day remedy is there to keep you awake and keep you feeling alive and being able to concentrate and get on with your day. And the night remedy would actually have a different combination of the mesobrine alkaloids, because depending on which one you have, the feeling in your body is actually different. So they say sometimes high levels of mesobrine makes you very, very alert. And that would obviously not be a good one for the end of the day. So it's the
I would need the
concentration of the alkaloids that determines whether it makes you feel more relaxed for calming to sleep, or wakes you up to be able to concentrate and deal with attention deficit.
Okay, so I need the day one for when I'm playing bridge.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Professor. Good night.
It's
Thank
a pleasure.
you.
Thank you.